He squinted toward the bushes near the dried-up creek. A faint sound, then a tall figure burst out and stumbled to the ground. Reed immediately raised his rifle and walked forward cautiously. It was an Apache woman. Her body was covered in dust and dried blood, veins bulging in her arms. Her face sunburned, but her dark eyes still burning with fire. She was gasping for air, her voice raspy from thirst as she raised both hands. "Do not shoot. I can bear you, children. Just let me live." On her other arm, Reed could see a bruised fracture, the blood already dried. Her legs were scraped and bleeding, but she held her back straight. Reed stood still, rifle barrel, unmoving. A flash of his late wife crossed his mind those days when she lay in bed, just as broken. Finally, Reed lowered his rifle, unhooked the canteen from his belt, and tossed it to the ground in front of her. "Drink it, then come with me." Takina said nothing. She picked up the water and drank it all, then nodded. Reed turned and walked back toward the ranch, knowing full well that his solitary life had just changed. Behind him, the sound of Takina's footsteps, uneven but steady, matched the rhythm of his heart, which was now beating harder with every step. Takina lay in the corner of the horse stable, her back against the wooden wall, eyes wide open in the darkness. Her hand clutched a small knife tightly, like a wild animal ready to strike if cornered. From the porch, Reed watched her. His shadow stretched long across the dirt. He still was not used to having someone else on his land, especially an Apache woman, someone the town saw as an enemy. By the next morning, when Reed stepped out into the yard, Takina had already been awake for a while. She was drawing water from the well, washing her face, then quietly cleaning the stable, no orders given, no one watching over her. By midday, a young calf broke loose near the damaged fence. Reed had just grabbed the rope when Takina rushed ahead of him. Though she still limped, she quickly herded the calf back into the pen, her movements fast and precise. When the gate was finally shut, she stood there catching her breath, her face covered in sweat and dust, but her eyes still burned with determination. Reed stood watching for a long moment. He said nothing, just gave a small nod, then turned back to his post, hammering in wooden stakes. As the sun began to set, Takina built a small fire outside the stable and roasted some dried meat she had brought with her. Reed came out with a tin mug of warm milk, setting it down beside the fire without a word. Takina looked at him, her gaze no longer as guarded. That night, as Reed stood on the porch, he heard the wind sweeping across the fields, and the faint sound of wood clinking from the stable as Takina secured the door. He realized this ranch, once filled with nothing but silence, now had a second breath, strong and defiant. But somehow, it made the place feel less empty. That evening, the summer wind picked up, dragging dark clouds across the sky. Reed was stacking firewood when he heard a faint cough from the horse stable. He walked over and found Takina sitting with her knees drawn up, her forehead damp with sweat, her shoulders trembling slightly. "You have a fever," Reed said in a low voice. Takina looked up, her eyes wary out of instinct. But she did not push his hand away as he knelt to examine the wound. The cut on her calf was red and swollen, with pus seeping out. Reed stood and brought back a basin of hot water, a knife heated until red, and a clean piece of cloth. Takina clenched her teeth as he carefully lanced the infection, cleaned the wound, and bandaged it. Sweat rolled down her cheek, but she did not make a sound. When he finished, Reed placed a thick blanket beside her. "Get some rest. It is going to rain tonight." Night fell for real. Rain pattered on the tin roof. Reed sat by the fire inside the cabin, listening to distant thunder. Suddenly, he saw Takina's figure at the door, her clothes soaked and clinging to her, arms holding the blanket. "Come in," Reed said, tossing another log onto the fire. Takina sat by the hearth, her broad hands stretched toward the warmth. The firelight cast shadows across her sun-worn face, making the small scar on her cheekbone stand out. After a long silence, she spoke in a hoarse voice. "I was captured with my younger sister. They tied us to a post and marched us for weeks. My sister did not survive. They hurt her. I cut myself free and ran all night to escape. Since then, I have not slept peacefully." Reed stared into the flames. "I lost my wife and son to fever. This house used to be full of laughter. Now it is only the wind." The two sat quietly. No comfort, no promises, just the fire burning between two souls who had been left behind. Outside, the rain poured down, washing the dust from the earth. Inside the cabin, the silence was no longer cold, it felt like shelter. When Takina stood to return to the stable, she left the old blanket on the chair and wrapped herself in the new one Reed had given her. He watched her go, sensing that the invisible distance between them had just grown a little smaller. The next morning, the clouds still hung heavy over the hilltops. Reed headed toward the northern fence to check, but stopped in his tracks. On the damp ground were clear trails of fresh hoofprints. 1, then 2, then 3, lined up and pointing straight toward the ranch before curving away. Reed knelt down, touched the damp soil. These were not from any of his cattle, and definitely not from horses belonging to anyone local. He knew every horse in Cinderbrush like the back of his hand. Back in the yard, he saw Takina carrying a bucket of water. "What happened?" she asked, seeing the grim look on his face. "Someone came close to the fence last night," Reed answered tersely, loading his Winchester. Takina set the bucket down, her eyes darkening. "They might come back. Those men do not give up easily." Reed stood silent, rifle in hand. He knew the safest choice was to send her away to bring peace back to his land. But as he looked at Takina standing upright, one leg still stiff with pain, eyes unshaken, something tightened in his chest. "You can leave now," he said slowly. "If you move fast, they may not catch your trail." Takina said nothing. She simply bent down, picked up the old knife from the wooden crate, checked the blade, and slid it back into its sheath. "I have been running long enough," she said softly. "If they want to come, I will be waiting." Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then we get ready." All afternoon, the two worked without pause. Reed boarded up the windows with wooden planks and reinforced the doors. Takina moved the dry straw away from the cabin to prevent fire, gathering wood and stacking it into piles. As night fell, Reed pulled a chair out onto the porch, rifle resting across his lap. Takina sat by the stable door, the tip of her spear grounded in the dirt. No words were spoken, but the silence between them was no longer distant. It felt like the shared understanding of two warriors before a battle. A gust of wind passed by, carrying the scent of scorched grass from somewhere far off. Reed tightened his grip on the rifle stock. He knew that from this moment on, if anyone dared step onto this land, they would not leave without blood being spilled. "I truly appreciate having you here." And if this story brought back old memories of dusty afternoons and the sound of hooves echoing deep in your chest, go ahead and subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together again. And I will tell you one more story from the West. The next morning, the sun blazed red, casting a heat that felt like it could scorch the earth. Reed carried a box of nails out to the field, and Takina followed behind with a bucket of water. They worked nearly the entire day without a break, driving in new wooden posts, stretching out fresh barbed wire. Reed was used to working alone, but today, he barely had to say a word. Takina swung the hammer with steady strength, each strike ringing out in rhythm. Sweat ran down her back, glistening against her bronze skin. Reed glanced over. This woman worked like a man, but there was something fierce and upright in her that made it hard to look away. Around midday, while pulling a stretch of wire, it suddenly snapped back and whipped across the back of Reed's hand, drawing blood. He winced slightly, but before he could tend to it, Takina stepped forward and grabbed his hand. "Let me see," she said, her voice low but firm. Reed sat on a wooden post and let her wrap the wound with a clean strip of cloth. Her movements were slow, steady, her broad hand surprisingly gentle. When he looked up, their eyes met. The afternoon sun cast its light through, reflecting deep within her dark eyes. "Thank you," Reed said quietly. Takina said nothing, just let go of his hand, then stood and went back to work. By late afternoon, they were herding the cattle back into the pen. Red dust swirled under the setting sun, their shadows stretching long across the ground. When the herd had settled, Reed leaned against a post, breathing hard, his shirt soaked with sweat. Takina sat on the porch steps, breathing heavily too, her face smudged with dust but her eyes still burning bright. That night, they sat in front of the fire inside the cabin. No words, just the sound of wood crackling in the flames. Reed poured a cup of coffee and handed it to her. Takina took it, drank a small sip, then set it down. The moment hung between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. Reed leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her face. Takina slowly leaned forward. The kiss came naturally, not rushed, not forced, like an unspoken truth that they had found each other in this harsh land. When they parted, Reed simply nodded, then stood to add another log to the fire. Takina turned away, but the corner of her mouth lifted the first smile she had shown since the day she arrived. That night, for the first time, Reed slept deeply. The wind no longer sounded like morning. The following afternoon, the sky was eerily overcast. Reed was inspecting the cattle pen when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. He squinted toward the fence. 3 riders were approaching, red dust swirling behind them. Reed set the bucket down and walked straight onto the porch. He took the Winchester from its place on the wall, loading it slowly but with steady hands. Takina emerged from the stable, spear in hand, her dark eyes narrowing in warning. The 3 men on horseback stopped at the gate. The one in front spat on the ground, his crooked smile full of menace. "We heard there's an Apache hiding out around here. Hand her over, and you won't have any trouble." Reed stood tall, his shadow filling the doorway. The rifle rested in his hands, barrel pointed down but ready to lift in an instant. "There's no one here but me," Reed said slowly. The man sneered, glancing toward Takina, who stood half-hidden by the porch. "Then what's that?" Takina stepped fully into view, standing right beside Reed. Her shoulders were bare, old scars etched clearly beneath the dust. She did not lower her spear. Her gaze locked onto the men, unwavering. "She stays," Reed said, his voice like steel. "This is my land." The air grew thick with tension. One of the riders reached for his revolver, but the leader held up a hand. He squinted at Reed, then spat again. "We'll be back, and when we come back, you'll regret choosing her." With that, all 3 turned their horses and galloped off, a cloud of red dust rising in their wake. Reed lowered his rifle, breathing slowly. Takina did not move, her grip on the spear so tight her knuckles turned white. "They will not stop," she said. Reed nodded. "Then neither will we." That afternoon, the ranch became a fortress. They added extra latches to the doors and reinforced the windows with wooden planks. Takina dug trenches around the stable to guard against fire attacks, while Reed stacked sandbags to block the entryway. As night fell, they sat by the fire, the golden light casting sharp shadows across their tense faces. Takina sharpened her spear with slow, steady strokes, while Reed cleaned the rifle, each movement careful, almost ceremonial. Outside, the prairie was silent, but heavy with threat. They both knew tomorrow night would not be quiet, and they were ready. The next night, heavy rain fell. The downpour pounded against the tin roof, sweeping the scent of wet earth into the cabin. Reed sat inside, rifle laid across the table, waiting like a wolf guarding its territory. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open in the wind. Reed jumped to his feet, grabbing the lantern and his gun. The yellow glow swept across the yard, revealing Takina. She wore a soaked blanket over her shoulders, a cloth bag on her back, walking quickly toward the fence. "Takina," Reed shouted, his voice cutting through the rain. She froze, her shoulders tense. "I cannot let you lose everything because of me. If I leave, they will not hurt you." Reed stepped forward, rain pouring down his face. "You think I would just let you disappear like that?" Takina turned, eyes flaring with anger. "You do not owe me anything. I am the one who brought trouble here." Reed walked fully into the muddy yard, rifle in hand, though the barrel pointed down. Rain lashed across his shoulders, ice cold. "Listen to me, Takina," he said through clenched teeth. "I have already lost my wife and son, lost every reason to hold on to this land. If you leave, I will have one more regret to carry." She clutched the strap of her bag, chest rising and falling. Reed shouted, voice breaking, "I would rather lose this entire ranch than lose you." His words struck like thunder through the storm. Takina stood still, her dark eyes glowing in the night. The bag slipped from her hand and fell with a soft thud into the mud. Slowly, she stepped toward Reed. Rain soaked her hair, streaming down her cheeks like tears. "Are you not afraid of the price you might pay for this choice?" Reed lowered the rifle and gripped her shoulders. "No, because I am not alone anymore." The silence that followed was filled only by the roar of the rain. Takina let the blanket fall from her shoulders, standing tall like a warrior before battle. Together, they walked back to the cabin. Reed threw more wood onto the fire, and the flames flared up bright and strong. Takina sat down on the floor, back against the wall, eyes following Reed as he cleaned his rifle. For the first time, They were not just two souls taking shelter under the same roof. They were allies, ready to face the morning together, whether it brought blood or freedom. At sunrise the next morning, the sky burned red, as if warning of a violent day ahead. Reed had been up early, standing on the porch with his Winchester fully loaded. Takina tied her hair back tight, her spear propped up by the door. Neither spoke, but both knew today would bring everything to an end. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, first faint, then louder, until red dust clouded the front gate. 5 riders appeared, revolvers hanging at their sides. The leader curled his lip in a smirk. "One last chance, old man. Hand her over and keep your life." Reed did not move. He raised the Winchester, the barrel catching the morning light. "You set foot past that fence, and none of you leave whole." A deadly silence fell. Takina stepped off the porch, her bare shoulders damp with sweat, standing beside Reed like a bronze statue. The leader spat into the dirt. "Then shoot, if you've got the guts." A rifle cracked loud and sharp. The bullet struck the wooden post just inches from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, screaming. The men cursed, drew their guns, and fired back. Reed and Takina dropped behind the sandbags, returning fire with precision. Within minutes, the dust flared up again, this time as the riders turned tail, fleeing while firing wildly behind them. When the sound of hooves faded into the distance, Reed lowered his rifle, shoulders tense. Silence returned to the ranch. Only the scent of gunpowder and the pounding of their hearts remained. Takina stepped onto the porch, her eyes sweeping the field before landing on Reed. They both exhaled, as if a great weight had finally been lifted. "It's over," Reed said. Takina nodded, the corners of her lips curling into the first true smile. That afternoon, they worked together to rebuild the broken fence, driving in new posts. When the work was done, Reed leaned against a post, watching the golden sunlight spill across the prairie. Takina came beside him, her wide hand reaching for his calloused one. "This ranch," she said softly. "It's mine now, too." Reed nodded. "And you are not going anywhere." As dusk settled, they sat together on the porch steps. The glow from the fire inside lit the yard with a warm light, casting the shadows of 2 figures sitting close in peace and quiet. For the first time in years, Reed felt this land was no longer just something he protected, it had become a home. Dear friends, true love does not come from pretty promises, it comes from muddy hands that still hold tight through the storm. It is when 2 broken hearts dare to trust again, dare to stand side by side in the face of danger. In the harsh West, a love like that does not just save a life, it saves a soul, turning wild earth into a place to begin again. It has been a joy riding alongside you, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. I wish you happiness and peace, wherever you are. I love you all. Tell me what you felt about this story. Leave a comment down below. Press 1 if you liked the story. And do not forget to subscribe channel to catch the next dramatic tale from the Wild West. From a distance, he saw the door of an old shack banging loosely in the wind. He walked closer, planning to tie it shut to prevent a wildfire. But when he pushed it open, the stench of rot mixed with dried blood hit him like a wall. In the corner of the shack, an Apache woman sat slumped against the wall, her eyes wide open but lifeless. Her thin legs were bound with a frayed rope, and bruised wounds along her shins had already begun to fester. In front of her sat a bull, bone dry for who knows how long. Elias stood still for a beat. The girl wheezed faintly, gripping a small piece of leather in her hand. When his shadow fell across her, she turned her head to look, eyes black as ash, filled with both fear and resignation. "Do you still want to live?" Elias asked, his voice rough but firm. There was no reply, only a slow blink. He drew his knife and cut the rope, then lifted her into his arms. She was too light, like a dry branch. Yet her body, lean and solid, showed she had once been a warrior. "Let's go," Elias said, placing her on the saddle. "If you die out here, no one will ever know." The wind kicked up dust around them as he spurred the horse toward the ranch. Behind them, the old shack leaned in silence, a mute witness to a tragedy yet to be told. When they reached the ranch, Elias dismounted and carried the girl into the cabin. The simple wooden room was bathed in soft evening light pouring through the cracks in the door, casting their shadows across the floor. He laid her gently on the narrow bed and pulled a blanket up to her chest. She did not resist, but her hand still clutched the piece of leather, her knuckles pale from strain. Elias lit the fire, poured some cornmeal into boiling water. The faint scent of thin porridge spread through the room. He placed the bowl on the table, pulled out a chair, and lit a cigarette. He said nothing. After a long while, she managed to sit up, her arms trembling. Her dark eyes tracked Elias like a wounded animal watching a stranger. She reached out for the bowl and drank in slow sips, never taking her eyes off him. "You are not going to die," Elias said quietly, not turning around. "At least not tonight." She did not answer. She set the bowl down and hugged the piece of leather to her chest again. When the sun had fully set, Elias brought over a bucket of warm water and placed it on the floor. "Wash up," he said, pointing to a clean cloth. She hesitated, then bent forward to wipe the dried blood from her face. As the grime came off, it revealed sharp features and hardened eyes. This was no weak soul, but a warrior who had been brought down. Night fell. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. An owl called from across the field. Elias lay stretched out on the long bench, his gun within arm's reach. In the dark, he heard her shifting. She did not sleep, only leaned her head against the wall, eyes fixed on the window. Every noise from the yard made her tense, as if ready to bolt even though her legs could no longer carry her. Elias opened his eyes and looked at her silhouette against the wall, small, but drawn tight like a bowstring. "No one is coming for your life here," he said hoarsely, his voice calm, almost like talking to himself. Silence. Only the wind answered. Around midnight, Elias sat up at the sound of a dry cough. He got up, poured some water, and handed it to her. She took it, and for the first time, whispered a faint word, barely audible. "Thank you." Elias nodded and returned to his place. That night, the cabin held two rhythms of breath, one deep, one shallow, but together, they kept the fire from going out. The next morning, golden sunlight streamed through the cabin window. Elias opened the door, letting the early breeze drift in and sweep out the scent of smoke. The Apache girl still sat on the bed, her back against the wall, clutching the piece of leather. Her dark eyes tracked Elias's every move, still wary, but no longer gripped by the panic she had shown the day before. "You cannot stay in bed forever," Elias said quietly, then stepped outside. All morning, the sounds of sawing and hammering echoed from the yard. By noon, Elias came back into the cabin, carrying a wooden frame mounted on two old wagon wheels. "Try sitting in this." She eyed the strange contraption with hesitation. Elias stepped forward and helped her into it. The wooden chair creaked, but it held firm. He handed her the wheels. "Push." She gave it a try, awkward at first, but the chair moved a short distance. For a brief moment, a faint smile crossed her sun-darkened face. It was the first change in expression Elias had seen. That afternoon, Elias brought her out onto the porch. She practiced wheeling across the uneven ground. Sweat gathered on her brow, but she did not stop. Each time the wheels snagged in a rut, she gritted her teeth and forced them through. Elias stood nearby, saying nothing, simply watching. By the time the sun began to set, she stopped at the water trough. The gray horse stepped over to sniff her, and she reached out to stroke its mane. In that quiet moment, Elias stood a few paces away and saw something in her eyes, the light of someone who had just reclaimed a sliver of freedom. That evening, Elias added another chair to the cabin, placing it near the fire. She sat in her wheelchair, turning the leather piece in her hands. But for the first time, she set it down on the table instead of holding it tight. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his voice low, "I need to fix the fence. You can hold the nails for me." She looked at him for a beat, then gave a small nod. No words, but it was the clearest answer Elias had ever gotten from her. The firelight cast their shadows onto the wall, one tall and lean, the other seated in a wheelchair like two lost souls who had just found a reason to stay under the same roof. That afternoon, the sky darkened without warning, and rain came pouring down as if tearing through the parched land. The cabin dimmed, wind driving water through the cracks in the door, and the scent of wet earth flooded in. Elias stoked the fire higher, and the room glowed red and warm. The girl sat in her wheelchair, silently watching the flames. Her shoulders were tense, as if bracing against a storm not just outside but within herself. "Do you have a name?" Elias asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. She nodded slowly. "Takina." Elias repeated the name, tasting the unfamiliar sound on his tongue. It is beautiful. Takina looked down at her calloused hands, her voice no louder than the wind. My father gave me that name when I was born. It means one who stands firm. But, ever since my legs failed, they started calling me Burden. The tribe left me beyond the borderland when the dry season came. They said I should find my own way to die. Elias was quiet. Rain lashed the wooden roof like a whip. He slowly sat down across from her, eyes never leaving her face. I lost everything once, he said. My wife died during the plague. My son followed not long after. I sold off the herd and stayed here, just working to forget. Silence settled again. The fire popped and crackled, casting their shadows on the wall, two strangers slowly starting to see each other. Takina turned her face away, but her voice trembled. I used to think no one would ever pick up a crippled woman unless it was to make her a slave. Elias leaned forward. I do not need a slave. Here, all you need to do is live. The rest, we will figure out. A streak of lightning tore across the sky, lighting up Takina's face. Rain slipped through the crack in the door, trailing down the wooden floor. She wiped it quickly, then let out a soft laugh, the first. Brief, but real. Elias leaned back in his chair, watching her a little longer than necessary. That night, though rain tapped steadily on the roof, the cabin no longer felt like a dark place. It felt like shelter not just from the storm outside, but from the storms that had haunted them for years. I am truly grateful for your presence here. If this story reminded you of the old days, those dusty afternoons, the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. So each day, we can sit together again, and I will tell you another story from the Wild West. The next morning, the sky was clear after the night's rain. The ground was still damp, carrying the earthy scent of wild grass. Takina wheeled the wooden chair out into the yard for the first time. Under the morning sunday, the light touched her sun-darkened face, revealing faint scars across her temple. Elias was repairing fence posts. He glanced over and saw her stop by the woodpile, picking up each piece of firewood and stacking them neatly. Her muscular arms tensed, shoulders leaning forward. Takina was showing that she was not a burden. As the sun rose higher, sweat beaded along her temple. But she did not stop. Elias walked over and set a canteen beside her. That is enough. You are running a fever again. Takina lifted her chin. I do not want to just sit inside. Elias gave a slight nod and returned to his work. He did not stop her again. That afternoon, Takina rolled her chair closer to the main road, where red dust blurred the distant horizon. A stranger on horseback rode by, pulled up, and stared at her. A crippled squaw, he sneered, using the slur with a mocking grin. Takina held her head high. Her dark eyes did not flinch. Move on, she said, her voice cold as steel. The man laughed louder, about to say more when footsteps sounded behind him. Elias stood there, his rifle slung loosely over one shoulder, his gray eyes steady and hard. Something funny going on here? He asked evenly. The man fell silent. The tension between Elias and the rider stretched taut like wire. At last, the man cleared his throat and spurred his horse away. Takina watched him go, then turned back. Elias had not moved, not said a word. You did not need to step in, she said quietly. I did not, Elias replied. Just stood behind. They held each other's gaze for a long moment. For the first time, Takina let her shoulders ease. The wheelchair turned back toward the cabin, its wheels rolling smooth across the dirt. That night, with the fire flickering in the stove, Takina left the piece of leather on the table, no longer clutching it to her chest. Elias glanced at it briefly, then sat across from her. Tomorrow, I will build you a lower work table, he said, so you will not have to bend. Takina looked up, and in her dark eyes was a light that words could not quite name. For the first time, she nodded like a silent thank you. The next day, before the sun had fully risen, Elias was already carrying fresh wooden planks out into the yard. Takina followed in her wheelchair, pulling along a bucket of nails and a hammer. Give it to me, she said, holding out her hand. Elias raised an eyebrow but handed her the short-handled hammer. Takina leaned forward and began driving nails into the board. Each strike was not strong, but it was sure. Elias stood beside her, securing the upper plank. They worked in silence, the sounds of hammering and wood tapping like a steady heartbeat. By late afternoon, the cattle pen had a brand new fence. Elias planted his hands on his hips, sweat running down his neck. Takina rolled back a little, inspecting the work, the corner of her mouth curving slightly. "Not bad," she said, brief and to the point. Elias let out a quiet chuckle. "That might be the first compliment I have ever heard from you." As the late sun turned golden, they sat together on the front steps. Elias handed her the canteen. His calloused hand brushed lightly against her fingers, a fleeting touch, but it made both of their hearts pause for a beat. That night, the cabin glowed with firelight. Elias added more wood to the stove, then took a seat across from Takina. She let her thick black hair down, and it fell across her shoulders, carrying the scent of smoke and sweat from a long day. Elias poured her a small cup of whiskey. "A sip. It will help you sleep." Takina took a small taste. The fire's glow reflected in her dark eyes, making them shine like embers. She set the cup down and looked at Elias longer than necessary. "Why did you save me that day?" she asked. Elias was quiet for a while, then answered, "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind." The room fell still. Takina pushed her chair a little closer. The space between them narrowed to a single breath. For the first time, Elias reached out, gently brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. She did not pull away. The kiss came slowly, not awkward, not rushed as if both had been waiting for it far too long. When they parted, Takina tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes no longer wary, but deep and warm. "Tomorrow," Elias said softly, his voice gravelly, "we will take the cattle out to the southern field. You can help me check the pasture." Takina nodded. That night, the fire burned longer than usual, and the cabin no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It had begun to feel like home. 2 days later, while Elias was checking the water trough in the yard, the thunder of hooves echoed in the distance. A group of men from town rode up, kicking up clouds of red dust. Leading them was Foreman, the head of the town council. "Ward," Foreman barked, pulling his horse to a halt at the gate. "We heard you are harboring a crippled squaw out here. You know the law. Apaches are not allowed on this land." Elias slowly set the water bucket down and wiped his hands on his pants. "She is my guest. No one touches her." "Guest, huh?" Foreman spat on the ground. "People like her only bring trouble. Last night, some cattle went missing near the creek. Folks in town think someone from her tribe got tipped off." Takina wheeled herself out from the cabin. The late sun cast lines of shadow across her face, highlighting the veins in her strong arms. "I did not warn anyone," she said firmly. Foreman let out a dry laugh. "So you speak our language? Good. Then listen close. Leave before the moon rises, or we will drag you out." Elias stepped forward, one hand resting on the grip of his gun. "She stays. This is my land. Anyone crosses that fence will be in the dirt before sunrise." The air turned heavy. The other men glanced at one another. Foreman grunted, turned his horse. "You are asking for trouble, Ward. Tonight will not be quiet." As the group rode off, Takina turned her chair toward Elias. "You did not have to do that. They will come back." Elias looked at her for a long moment, his gaze cold and sharp. "If you leave, I lose this ranch. If you stay, at least I have something worth protecting." Takina gripped the wheel tightly and took a deep breath. "Then I will stay." That evening, Elias checked every round of ammunition and bolted the windows shut. Takina sat by the fire, sharpening a short blade, her hands steady, her eyes no longer afraid. For the first time, they were not just the rescuer and the rescued. They were two people preparing for battle, standing shoulder to shoulder. That night, the wind howled through the darkness, and even the insects seemed to fall silent. Elias sat close to the window, his Winchester resting across his lap. Takina sat by the fire, a short knife strapped to her side. Her eyes calm, eerily calm. The sound of horses echoed in the distance, growing louder with every second. Torches flickered outside the cabin. Foreman and nearly a dozen men had surrounded the house. "Ward!" the shout rang out. "Bring the woman out. This is your last chance." Elias unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. "Go home, boys. There is no one here for you." One burly man raised his gun and fired into the air. "Drag her out, and we can all be home before sunrise." Gunfire erupted. Elias ducked behind a porch beam and returned fire. His shot clipped the hat clean off the man who had just fired. The gang scattered, shouting and yelling across the yard. Takina crawled out from the cabin, sliding a fresh clip toward Elias. You are not alone. The gunfight lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, a bullet grazed Elias's shoulder, soaking his shirt with blood. But just as he chambered another round, Foreman raised a hand and shouted, "Enough! Back off!" The men pulled their horses back, eyes still fixed on Elias and Takina, both standing firm in the doorway. Foreman spat into the dirt, his voice tight with venom. "You chose your side, Ward. Do not regret it." They rode off, leaving behind smoke, dust, and the stinging scent of gunpowder. Elias leaned on his knee, breathing heavy. Takina wheeled closer, wrapped a clean strip of cloth around his wound. "You kept your word," she whispered. Elias looked at her, gray eyes tired but unwavering. "From now on, this is your home. No one touches you." At sunrise, the first light swept across the field. Takina rolled out to the porch and sat beside Elias. Together, they watched the cattle wander through the dewy grass, the morning sun gilding her dark hair. For the first time, Elias saw his cabin not as a lonely outpost but as something worth defending. And Takina, her hand steady on the wheel, her face softened. She was no longer someone left behind. She had chosen to stay. "My friend, true love is not afraid of dust or gunfire. It survives beyond judgment and old scars just to let two people wake up side by side with the rising Sunday. Kindness is the final thread that binds us together. When we reach out to save a stranger, we are also saving the last good part of ourselves. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you are healthy and happy. I love you all, my dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know how you felt about this story. Leave a comment down below. Type 1 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe channel for more dramatic tales from the Wild West. Next to the well, under the shade of a dry tree, a figure lay motionless. Luke stepped down, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. As he got closer, he saw it was an Apache woman, tall, powerfully built, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle, dried blood crusted around the leather legging. Her sun-darkened face was smeared with dust, her lips cracked and dry. She was still breathing, faint but steady. In her hands, she clutched a small leather pouch. Holding it so tightly it looked like letting go would mean death. Luke knelt beside her, quickly checking the injury. Not an open fracture, but serious enough to make walking impossible. He glanced around, no sign of anyone else, but there were old hoofprints leading west. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her deep black eyes, filled with suspicion, scanned his face, then stopped at the gun on his hip. Luke paused, then slowly unhooked the canteen from his saddle and brought it to her lips. "Drink." She sipped slowly, never letting go of the pouch. Once she regained a bit of strength, Luke lifted her onto the horse and secured her injured leg with rope. "All right," he muttered, climbing into the saddle. "Let's get you home before the sun cooks us both." They rode away from the abandoned well, red dust rising behind them, carrying with it a secret yet to be told. The horse galloped down the dusty road until the silhouette of the cabin appeared on the hill. Luke pulled the reins, jumped down, and lifted the woman off the saddle. Her body was heavy and solid like a sandbag, yet it trembled slightly from exhaustion. He pushed open the cabin door and laid her on the old bed in the corner. She immediately propped herself up, clutching the leather pouch tightly to her chest, her black eyes full of suspicion. "Easy. I am not here to take that from you," Luke said, his voice low and steady. He rolled up his sleeves, pulled out some bandages, a bottle of strong liquor, and a small knife. "Your leg needs to be splinted, or it is going to get worse." She said nothing. When he leaned down, she gave a faint nod. Luke carefully cut the pant leg open, exposing the break. He poured liquor over it, and blood seeped out. She gritted her teeth through the pain, sweat beading on her forehead, but not a single sound escaped her lips. "Stubborn as a mule," Luke muttered as he placed 2 wooden slats alongside her leg and tied them tightly with rope. When he was done, he set a canteen and a blanket next to her. "Stay here. I will sleep on the porch." She did not answer, only turned her head to watch him as he walked away. Night fell fast. Wind howled through the cracks in the door, carrying the scent of dry grass. Luke lay on a long bench out on the porch, his revolver resting at his side. From inside the cabin, firelight flickered through the gap in the door, casting her shadow long across the wall. She did not sleep. All night, She sat leaning against the wall, one hand gripping the pouch. Every sound outside made her eyes snap open. In the darkness, Luke opened his eyes and stared through the narrow gap. He knew the woman was standing guard not just against whoever was chasing her, but against him too. Around midnight, the wind picked up, cold and sharp. The door creaked. Luke heard her cough softly, then the rustle of the blanket as she pulled it tighter around herself. He closed his eyes again and let out a long breath. Tomorrow, he thought, I need to find out what the hell she is carrying in that pouch that she will not let go of. The moon climbed higher. The cabin sank into silence, but in that silence, something had begun to form. Not trust, not yet, but a fragile thread connecting two lost souls in the desert night. The sun rose, its light spilling through the cracks in the door. Luke opened his eyes and stepped into the cabin. The woman was still sitting against the wall, but she looked more alert now, her eyes no longer wild with fear. You are still alive. Good, Luke muttered as he stirred the fire back to life. He tossed in some cornmeal, and the smell of thin porridge began to fill the room. She watched him, her gaze cold but not entirely distant. When the bowl was placed in front of her, she took it and ate slowly. Luke sat at the table, saying nothing, just watching. When she finished, she pushed herself up with her hands, trying to stand. Luke frowned. Your leg is still broken. You need to rest. She shook her head and gestured for a cane. Luke hesitated, but handed it to her. She hobbled out to the porch, sweat gathering on her temples. Where are you going? Luke asked. She pointed toward the small well near the cattle shed. Then be careful, Luke replied, turning toward the yard. When he returned, he found her sitting by the trough, scooping water to give the horse a drink. Her movements were slow and deliberate. The horse, usually skittish, stood still. That afternoon, she dragged bundles of dry straw into the barn. Luke was surprised she could have chosen to lie down and rest. But she chose to work instead. You don't have to do that, he said. She looked up, sweat trailing down her cheek, then pointed to the broken fence. Her meaning was clear. It needed fixing. They worked together. Luke hammered in the posts while she held the wire. Her hands were strong and steady, even as she leaned on the cane. When the job was done, Luke dropped to the ground with a deep breath. She brought him the canteen. Drink, she said, her voice hoarse but firm. Luke took it and drank deeply. He looked at her, his eyes softer than before. Thank you. That night, Luke no longer slept out on the porch. Instead, he lay on the long bench inside the cabin. She rested on the bed, still clutching the leather pouch, but this time with a blanket pulled up to her chest as if accepting his presence. The fire crackled in the stove, casting both their shadows onto the wall, two very different figures, slowly blending under the same roof. That night, the desert wind howled in gusts, making the cabin door tremble. Luke lay on the long bench, one hand resting lightly on the grip of his revolver. The fire crackled in the stove. Just as he began to drift off, a soft, rustling sound stirred the silence. Luke opened his eyes and glanced through the darkness. The girl was sitting upright, her back to him. Firelight flickered across the room, casting her shadow long and tall on the wall. Slowly, she opened the leather pouch. A faint metallic clink echoed in the room. Luke held his breath. Inside was a silver totem, carved in the shape of a wolf howling at the moon. Beneath it was an old, singed piece of leather map. She touched the totem with trembling fingers, then pressed it gently to her forehead, as if in ritual. What are you carrying? Luke's voice broke the silence, low and steady. She flinched and turned to face him. Her dark eyes flashed with caution, but the fear was no longer there. Proof, she said softly, her voice raspy from a dry throat. They accused my father of betraying the tribe. They plan to execute him at the next full moon. This totem proves he is innocent. I have to get it back in time. Luke propped himself up on one elbow. And the men chasing you? They want it. If I die, the truth dies with me. The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind wailed through the night, making the cabin shudder. Luke stood and walked toward her, looking straight into her eyes. Then you are not going anywhere until you are strong enough to stand. I will not let you die out here in the desert over that pouch. Her eyes blinked once, not from fear, but from surprise. No one had said anything like that to her since the day she was cast out. Luke turned back toward his place, his voice gravelly. Get some sleep. We still have fence mending to do in the morning. She quietly placed the totem back inside the pouch and pulled the blanket up around her. For the first time, her hand no longer gripped the pouch as if it were her last lifeline. Tonight, in the glow of the dancing fire, the cabin felt warmer, as if a silent pact had just been made between two strangers. I am truly grateful to have you here. If this story brought back memories, dusty afternoons, the sound of hooves echoing in your heart, then go ahead and subscribe to my channel. So each day, we can sit together once more, and I will share with you another tale from the Wild West. The next day, the sun blazed high in the sky. Luke was stacking lumber in the yard to build new fence posts, while Nieli hobbled along with her cane, dragging bundles of straw back to the barn. She worked in silence, stubbornly refusing to rest. While rummaging through the old storage shed looking for rope, she accidentally dropped a worn handkerchief. The fabric had faded with time, the pattern barely visible. Nieli bent down to pick it up and brushed off the dust. Luke stepped in at that exact moment. His eyes darkened. "Put it down," he said, his voice low like distant thunder. Nieli froze, then slowly placed the handkerchief on the table. "I was just trying to clean it." "Do not touch it," Luke growled. He picked up the cloth and folded it carefully, his eyes distant. The air turned heavy. Nieli pressed her lips together, then walked out into the yard, leaning on her cane, leaving Luke alone. The entire afternoon passed with barely a word between them. Only when the sun dipped below the horizon did Luke light the fire inside the cabin, the scent of smoke spreading through the room. Nieli came in and sat by the hearth, quietly placing a neatly folded blanket on the chair. "That handkerchief," Luke began, his voice slower now. "It belonged to my wife. She died during the epidemic. I kept it to remind myself that I once had a family." Nieli stared into the flames, saying nothing. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I had a family too. They said my father betrayed the tribe and cast me out. If I do not return the totem, he will die for something he did not do." The fire crackled between them. Luke sat beside her and let out a heavy sigh. "Maybe I overreacted." Nieli turned to him. Her dark eyes were tired but softer now. The silence stretched. The firelight cast their shadows on the wooden wall. Luke reached out, gently touching the scar on her shoulder. She did not pull away. The distance between them shrank. Their first kiss came not in a rush, but slowly, as if both had waited far too long for a moment like this. When they parted, Luke stood up and tossed another log into the stove. "Tomorrow, we finish the fence. I am going to need your help." Nieli nodded. That night, she slept deeply for the first time since arriving at the ranch, and Luke, for the first time, saw the cabin as more than a place of shelter. It was slowly becoming a home. Early the next morning, with dew still clinging to the grass, Luke heard the sound of hooves in the distance. He grabbed his gun and stepped out onto the porch. An Apache warrior rode up tall and lean, his face painted red, his eyes sharp like blades. He pulled his horse to a stop and stared directly at Luke. "I am looking for someone," he said, his voice rough. "A woman named Nieli. She stole the tribe's totem and fled. If it is not returned, blood will be spilled." Luke tightened his grip on the gun. "She is inside." Nieli stepped into the doorway, her legs still braced, but her gaze hard as stone. "I did not steal it. The totem was taken by someone else to frame my father. I only took back what was ours." The warrior sneered, eyes full of contempt. "That is what every traitor says. Your father has already been condemned. Bringing it back will not save him, only bring more shame to your family." The air grew thick. Luke looked at Nieli, and for the first time, he saw her anger falter just for a moment, replaced by a flicker of fear. When the warrior rode off, vowing to report back to the tribal council, Luke turned inside. He set the gun down on the table and looked at her squarely. "Is there anything you have not told me?" Nieli froze, her hand instinctively gripping the leather pouch. "I have told you the truth. If you do not believe me, I will leave." "Leave? Go where?" Luke snapped. "You can barely walk." "Then I will crawl if I have to." She shot back, eyes blazing. In that moment, the cabin seemed to shrink around them. Luke turned away, stepping onto the porch, taking a deep breath to rein in his anger. After a while, he returned, his voice low. "Maybe I was wrong. But I know one thing: if you walk out that door now, you will die." Nieli stood still, her chest rising and falling. After a long silence, she sat down in the chair, gripping the pouch as if to steady herself. "I do not want you caught up in this," she said softly. Luke sat across from her, eyes never leaving hers. "If you go, I go with you. I choose to stand with you, right or wrong." Nieli looked at him, and in her eyes was something more than fear. There was a glimmer of trust. That night, they reinforced the windows and prepared the ammunition, as if bracing for a storm. But this storm was not only coming from outside, it was rising from deep within their hearts. 3 days later, Nieli's leg had started to heal. She still leaned on her cane, but refused to let Luke go alone. "We have to bring the totem before the full moon," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the tribal council would gather. They prepared at first light, a canteen of water, some dried provisions, and a Winchester fully loaded. Luke strapped the leather pouch securely to the saddle, then turned to Nieli. "Let's go. This time, there is no turning back." The road into the mountains was silent, broken only by the sound of hooves and the wind. But less than a mile from the valley, a gunshot rang out. A bullet slammed into the trunk of a tree beside them. "Bandits," Luke growled, pulling Nieli off the horse and behind a boulder. 4 masked men charged from behind a patch of cacti. "Hand over the pouch," one of them shouted, aiming his gun. "Come and take it," Luke replied, his eyes cold. Gunfire erupted. Bullets kicked up clouds of dust. Luke returned fire, dropping one of them, but his shoulder jerked back. He had been grazed, blood soaking through his shirt. Nieli clenched her jaw, grabbed Luke's Winchester. Bracing herself with the cane, she stood tall, the barrel aimed at the leader. "Go, if you want to live," she said, her voice hoarse, but ringing like a command. The 2 remaining men exchanged a look, then dragged their fallen comrade and fled. Nieli dropped to her knees beside Luke and quickly tore fabric to bind the wound. "Can you still stand?" Luke gave a tired smile. "I promise to get you there. I am not dying yet." They pressed on until the firelight of the council circle appeared at the base of the mountain. The tribe stood in a solemn ring, their faces stern. Nieli stepped forward and handed the totem to the elder, recounting the entire truth. The silence was absolute. The elder took the totem, then gave a slow nod. "Your father will be spared. And this man," he said, turning to Luke, "stood with you. From this day forward, he is considered a friend of the tribe." Nieli turned to Luke. In the firelight, her dark eyes shimmered not with fear, for the first time, but with the quiet resolve of peace. They left the valley at dawn. Morning mist blanketed the fields, making the path home feel washed clean after a long night. Luke rode slowly, his wound bandaged, the cloth stained red with blood, but he never uttered a word of pain. Nieli walked beside him, limping slightly but holding her head high. She no longer clutched the leather pouch to her chest. It now hung at her side, tied to her belt, as if the burden had become a part of who she was. When the outline of the cabin appeared on the hill, Luke let out a quiet breath. "We are home." Nieli paused, looking at the weathered frame. "Home?" Luke nodded. "If you want it to be." She did not answer. Instead, she stepped into the yard, removed the brace from her leg, and began picking up the boards that had fallen during the last storm. Luke watched her, a faint smile playing on his lips. In the days that followed, they worked side by side as if nothing had ever happened. Luke drove new fence posts. Nieli led the horses back, repaired the water trough. Each evening, they stopped work at the same time, sitting on the steps, sharing a drink of water, silent, but no longer strangers. One evening, Luke hung the Winchester on the wall, as if drawing a line under the days of waiting for danger. Nieli sat near the fire, her dark hair down, her gaze softer than ever before. "I used to think I had nowhere to go back to," she said gently. "But this place, it no longer feels temporary." Luke sat beside her, his calloused hand resting over hers. "If you stay, we start over. Together." Nieli nodded, a rare smile passing across her lips. Spring arrived. The grasslands turned green again, stretching wide and alive. A new garden was planted. The cattle grew fat once more. The cabin was now filled with the sound of hammering wood, the splash of water pails, and even the occasional laughter carried on the breeze. One golden evening, as the sun set low, Luke stood on the porch, arms folded. Nieli stepped out and leaned against his shoulder. Together, they looked out over the horizon where the sun dipped behind the hills. "We managed to keep what mattered most," Luke said softly. Nieli smiled. "Freedom and a home." The last light faded from the sky, but inside the cabin, the fire still burned like the heartbeat of a new beginning. "My friends, love is not made of beautiful promises, but of hands willing to bandage each other's wounds. True sincerity does not need many words. It simply stands beside you when the whole world turns away." That is how two souls turned an old wooden cabin into a home, and how barren days became a life worth living. It has been an honor to share this journey with you, dear audience of Wild West storytelling. I truly hope life brings you happiness and peace. I love you all. Let me know what you thought of this story. Leave a comment down below. Press 1 if you enjoyed it. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic tales from the Wild West. He tightened the reins, eyes squinting. The scream was not like a normal human voice. It was hoarse, desperate, and mixed with the ferocious roar of a wild beast. Elias snapped the reins and drove the horse into the rocky crevice. The sight that met his eyes made his jaw clench. A frail old Apache man was being attacked by a massive gray wolf. A broken bow lay flung to the side, and blood was soaking into the sand. Without thinking, Elias yanked his Winchester from the leather holster. A sharp, thunderous shot rang out. The wolf was hit but not down. It lunged toward the old man. Elias fired a second shot, then leapt from his horse and unleashed a third at close range. The wolf let out a chilling howl and collapsed. Elias dropped to his knees beside the old man and rolled him onto his side. He was still breathing, though blood was pouring down his arm. "Can you hear me?" Elias asked, his voice low and steady. The old eyes opened, deep and bright like glowing embers. He gave a slight nod. "It is over. The wolf is dead." Elias helped him to his feet and tied a makeshift bandage around the wound with a rope. As the two rode out of the canyon, the sunset turned the sky a burning red. Elias had no way of knowing that saving this man's life would change his own forever and lead to the arrival of a woman who would bring warmth back to his once lonely ranch. 3 days after the bear incident, under a blood-red evening sky, Elias was staking the fence when the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. He braced an arm on the post and squinted. A lone rider appeared on the dusty red road. It was the old Apache man from before. Toka dismounted slowly. His arm was now bandaged with animal hide. But he was not alone. Beside him stood a tall Apache woman, her muscles clearly defined beneath her sun-darkened skin. Her thick black hair was half-braided, hanging over her shoulder. Slung across that shoulder was an old spear, like a symbol that she had once been a warrior. Elias set the hammer down and wiped the sweat from his brow. "You recovered fast." Toka nodded. "Because of you, I am still alive. According to our laws, a life for a life. Sana will stay here and help you until the debt is paid." Elias frowned, glancing at the woman. She stood still, arms crossed, her deep black eyes gleaming. There was no fear, no pleading. She looked more like a stone statue than someone being sent to repay a favor. "I do not need anyone to settle a debt," Elias said slowly. "That is not your choice," Toka replied firmly. "From now on, she belongs to this place until she chooses to leave." They exchanged a long look, as if two worlds were sizing each other up. Finally, Elias gave a small nod. "All right, but there are no chains here. She is free to work, or not." Toka seemed satisfied. He climbed back onto his horse. "Then it is done." He turned and rode off, leaving Sana standing alone in the red-dusted yard. Elias pointed toward the water trough. "There is water there. If you want to wash, the well is over there. The horse stall is empty. You can sleep there for now." Sana said nothing, just gave a small nod. Her steps were heavy but steady, and her tall frame cast a long shadow across the yard as the sun went down. That night, Elias sat alone on the porch, the Winchester laid across his lap. In the darkness, he saw Sana sitting with her back against the barn wall, eyes open, staring up at the star-filled sky. She did not sleep, like a wild animal still unsure if this place was safe. Elias poured a bit of whiskey into a tin cup and took a sip. "Well, Holt," he muttered, "this ranch has never had anyone else. And now, there is an Apache warrior woman in the yard. A night wind blew through, carrying the scent of dry grass. Elias felt something had shifted, a new kind of silence. Not empty, but heavy, as if waiting for something to begin. In the first few days, Sana barely stepped inside the cabin. She slept out by the horse stall, her back against the wall, eyes always half open through the night like a watchful sentinel. Elias kept leaving a portion of food on the wooden chair near the door, saying little. Each morning, he would find the empty bowl neatly placed back, a silent acknowledgement. On the third afternoon, as Elias herded the cattle back into the corral, he noticed the hay had been cleaned up. The stable looked tidier than usual, with the straw gathered into small piles. He stood there for a long while, leaning on the fence, watching Sana kneeling by the trough, her sun-darkened hands scooping water for the horses. "You don't have to do that," Elias called out, not too loudly. She looked up, her dark eyes flashing with a hint of defiance. Then she stood, brushed the dust off her leather dress, and continued working, as if his words were not worth answering. That evening, Elias set a pot of beans to cook on the porch. As Sana walked by, he nodded toward the wooden chair. "Sit. Eat with me." She stood still for a moment, then slowly took a seat. They ate in silence. Only the clinking of spoons against the bowls and the soft crackling of the fire broke the stillness. The next day, strong winds swept through, knocking down a section of the northern fence. Elias braced himself to replant the posts, but the rope was drawn too tight. It slipped from his grip and tore the skin on his palm open. Sana was carrying a bundle of straw when she saw the blood. Without a word, she dropped the bundle, walked over, tore a strip from the hem of her dress, and wrapped it tightly around his hand to stop the bleeding. Her hands were strong and rough, but her movements were unexpectedly gentle. Their eyes met. No thank you. No smile. Just a quiet nod. But to Elias, that moment meant more than any long conversation ever could. That night, Sana did not return to the horse stall. Instead, she sat near the porch, a few steps away from Elias, looking out over the open fields. As darkness fell, their shadows stretched side by side across the ground. "Tomorrow," Elias said, his eyes on the horizon, "we need to replace more fence posts. I'll need someone to hold the rope." Sana glanced at him and gave a small nod. For the first time, Elias felt the ranch was no longer completely empty. There were footsteps besides the sound of his own boots. And strangely, that made the desert night feel just a little less heavy. That afternoon, dark clouds loomed overhead. Elias and Sana had just finished mending the last stretch of fence before the storm rolled in. Both were drenched in sweat, their clothes coated with dust. "All done," Elias said, leaning against a fence post. Sana nodded and walked back toward the cabin, using a stick for support. As the rain began to fall, Elias lit the fire. Sana stood at the doorway, soaking wet, her broad shoulders and thick hair hanging down like a black waterfall. "Come in, or you'll catch cold," Elias said. She stepped inside and stood still in front of the fire until the warmth began to seep into her. Elias poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. Sana glanced at it, then took a small sip. After a while, Elias spoke, his voice slow and steady. "I used to have a wife. She died of fever 3 years ago. Since then, it's just been me and the cattle." Sana did not turn to look at him, but her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "People told me to sell the land and leave, but I could not. I buried her here. And this is all I have left." Elias stared into the fire, his voice sinking lower. Silence lingered. Finally, Sana set the cup down and moved a little closer to the fire. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, as if pulled from somewhere deep inside. "They called me bad luck. A man in my tribe hurt me when I was too young. Instead of punishing him, they cast me out. Said I had tainted the people." For the first time, Elias saw a real crack in her eyes. No longer just guarded. It was raw pain. He nodded slowly. "They were wrong." Sana turned to him, her dark eyes flickering, searching to see if he meant it. "Here," Elias said firmly. "No one sends you away. Not unless you want to leave." The room went quiet. Only the sound of rain tapping on the wooden roof filled the space. Sana turned back toward the fire, sitting still, but her shoulders eased, like she had finally set down a heavy stone. That night, she slept inside the cabin. She did not return to the horse stall. Elias lay on the long bench, listening to the sound of her breathing settle into the dark. For the first time in many years, The cabin no longer felt like a graveyard of the past. It was slowly becoming a home that was alive. I am deeply grateful for your presence here. And if this story brought back something familiar, those dusty red afternoons, the echo of hooves beating in your chest, then subscribe to my channel. So every day, we can sit together. And I'll tell you another tale from the West. That afternoon, the rain came without warning. The wind blew hard enough to tilt the fence, and the smell of wet earth hung thick in the air. Elias had just managed to herd the cattle into the barn when night fell. He stepped into the cabin, his shirt soaked through with rain. Sana came in shortly after, her leather pants clinging to her muscular legs, her black hair heavy with water. "Sit down," Elias said, motioning toward the fire. Sana sat near the hearth, her broad shoulders trembling slightly. Elias threw more wood into the stove, and the flames rose, casting golden light that danced across her sun-darkened skin. For a long time, the only sound was the rain drumming on the roof. Then Elias grabbed an old towel and stepped over. "Give me that," he said. Sana frowned, but let him dry her hair. His movements were slow and careful, as if afraid he might hurt her. The scent of smoke, rain, and sweat hung in the air. Heavy like a confession, neither of them could put into words. As Elias turned to hang the towel, Sana's eyes caught a small photo frame on the shelf, a faded portrait of a blonde woman. She stood, leaned on her cane, and gently brushed the dust from the glass. "Your wife?" she asked softly. Elias turned, and his gaze dropped. "Yeah. She's been gone 3 years." The cabin's air grew thick. Sana set the frame down and turned to face him, her dark eyes deep and searching, as if trying to see through the man in front of her. "And now you let me stay here. Do you regret it?" Elias stepped closer, now standing right in front of her. "No. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay..." He paused for a breath. "This place will be more than just a ranch." Only a breath separated them now. Sana held his gaze, her lips trembling slightly. And then, as if something inside him could no longer wait, Elias reached out and touched her face, his calloused hand brushing against her strong cheek. The kiss came slow, deep, and heavy, a promise unspoken, that neither of them would be alone anymore. The sound of the rain faded into the distance, leaving only the beating of hearts and the crackling of fire inside the cabin. When they pulled apart, Elias gave a small nod and stepped back. "We've got work tomorrow. Get some rest." Sana said nothing, just pulled a blanket around her shoulders and sat closer to the fire for a while longer. On her lips, a faint smile appeared, the first since she had set foot on the ranch. That night, Elias lay on the long bench, eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling. The cabin was no longer quiet the way it used to be. Something new was taking root in the air, something strong and irreversible. The next morning, the air was thick with dust. Elias was carving fence posts when the sound of hooves echoed through the valley. He looked up, eyes narrowing. A group of Apache warriors rode toward him. 6 men, their faces painted red, feathers swaying in the wind. Sana heard the horses and stepped out of the cabin, still gripping her cane. The wind blew her thick black hair back, her muscular shoulders tensing. The man in front shouted something in Apache, then switched to clipped English. "You there, the debt is paid. She comes back to the tribe. Give her back." Elias set down his hammer and walked to the porch. "She has her own legs. She chooses whether to stay or leave. I do not sell people, and I do not keep them either." Sana stepped forward and stood beside him. All eyes turned to her, waiting. A wave of hot wind swept through. Sana tightened her grip on the cane and took a deep breath. "I am not going back," she said firmly. The men on horseback muttered among themselves. One growled, "If you stay, they will call you a traitor. The word will spread across the tribes." Sana stood tall. "They cast me out once. Now I choose this place. Here, I am no longer afraid." Elias glanced at her, his gray eyes flashing with quiet pride. He turned to the warriors. "You heard her. Now ride on, before I change my mind." The air was thick and tense. Then the leader yanked the reins and turned his horse. "Remember what you said today. When the council hears of this, there will be consequences." They rode off in a cloud of red dust. Sana let out a heavy breath, sweat beading on her skin despite the dry heat. Elias placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tightness in her muscles. "You sure?" She turned to him, her dark eyes burning with resolve. I choose this, and if they come back, I still will not go. Elias nodded. Then from now on, you are not someone repaying a debt. You are part of this home. They stood in silence for a moment, then walked back into the cabin together. That night, Elias cleaned his Winchester, packing more bullets into the crate. Santa sharpened an old blade. Neither spoke it aloud, but both knew. The real storm was still ahead. 3 days later, Elias saddled the horse and put on his old wool coat. "Come with me to town," he said. Santa frowned, standing in the doorway with her cane pressed to the ground. "What for?" "So people know you're not just a ghost living out here," Elias replied, his eyes serious. They rode side by side to Broken Mesa, a dusty little town where rumors traveled faster than the wind. When Elias stepped into the general store, the room fell silent. A few cowboys froze, their eyes scanning Santa from head to toe. Broad shoulders, powerful arms, black eyes sharp as a blade. The shopkeeper cleared her throat, reluctantly. "Afternoon, Mr. Holt, and your companion." Elias gave a small nod. "This is Sana. She lives with me. From now on, if anyone has a problem with her, they've got a problem with me first." A scoffing laugh rang out from the corner. A drunken man, hat pulled low, stumbled to his feet. "A white man bringing that home," he sneered, pointing at Sana. The air turned to ice. Sana stood tall, her face cold as stone, but Elias stepped forward, grabbed the man by the collar. "Shut your mouth." The drunk spat on the floor. "Or what?" Elias's punch landed like lightning. The man crumpled to the ground, teeth scattering across the floor. The whole store fell dead silent. Elias stood over him, eyes scanning the room. "Anyone else got something to say?" No one answered. Sana remained still, shoulders squared. In her eyes, there was something that was not fear. Maybe, for the first time, it was the feeling of being protected. As they stepped outside, Toka was there, leaning on his cane. He looked at Elias, then at Sana, and gave a rare smile. "She is free now. The tribe holds no claim on her." Sana looked up at him, then exhaled as if a heavy weight had finally lifted. "Then I am staying. I owe nothing to anyone anymore." Elias climbed onto his horse and extended a hand. Sana placed her large, calloused palm into his. Steady, but gentle. On the ride back, the wind kicked up the dust again, but it no longer felt heavy. Elias glanced at the woman riding beside him. For the first time, he did not see a stranger on his land. He saw a true companion. Spring came late, but the grasslands finally turned a soft, fresh green. Elias built new fence lines, while Santa planted a small vegetable garden behind the cabin. The sound of hammering echoed all day, but this time it was not just one man. Every strike came from two hands working together, two shadows moving side by side beneath the sunday. One morning, as Elias was heading out to the cattle barn, Sana stepped forward, her hand resting on her belly. "I think there's a child." Elias froze for a moment, then nodded. "Then we'll need another room." The very next day, they began building a new wooden wall. Sana carried the heavy beams without complaint, her skin shining with sweat under the sunday. Elias sawed the planks, drove in every nail with care. That evening, they sat on the porch, drinking water from a tin flask. A cool breeze swept through, carrying the scent of damp earth and new grass. Elias looked toward the nearly finished room and smiled gently. "There'll be a window here, facing the pasture, so the child can wake to the first light of morning." Sana tilted her head slightly, a rare but warm smile curling at the corner of her lips. On the last cattle drive of the season, the two of them rode together, guiding the herd home. The sunset painted the fields in deep reds, dust rising behind the thundering hooves. Once the cattle were corralled, Elias stepped up to the porch and stood tall. Sana walked over and leaned her shoulder into him. In silence, they watched the sun slip behind the mountains. Elias placed his hand over hers, resting on her belly. "This ranch used to be where I buried my past. Now it's where our future begins." Sana turned to him, her dark eyes glistening in the evening light. "Because it's the place I chose to stay." Elias nodded, saying nothing more. They stood there as the sky faded to purple, with only the warm glow from the cabin casting long shadows of two people on the ground. For the first time, Elias no longer heard the emptiness of the desert wind, only the slow, steady breathing of a home that had finally come alive. "My friends, love is not about possession. It is about release. Someone who truly loves will forgive the past, accept every scar, and choose to stay when every other reason is gone. That kind of love turns loneliness into a home. It turns two broken people into a family. And in the end, my deepest wish is that you find happiness and peace. Always. I love all of you, the dear audience of Wild West storytelling. Let me know what this story meant to you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Type 1 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe for more dramatic tales from the Wild West.